It's Thomas here, and through this video essay I'm going to be using Jesus Colon's A Puerto Rican in New York and other sketches as a main source to both speak to the ways that the black experience in the Americas has impacted what it means to be black and Latina, as well as use this book as a launching pad into the discussion of how the creation of racial categories among Latina and Latin American communities has been influenced by the legacies of slavery, colonialism, and imperialism. So to start, there's a ton of significance between the intersection of identities within someone being black, Puerto Rican, and specifically in the city of New York. So there's a few things we need to answer. Why is it important that someone is both black and from Puerto Rico, and how do they find themselves in New York? Following the Spanish-American War that ended in 1988, Cuba gained its independence, but as a result, Guam and specifically Puerto Rico became U.S. territories, and what's so bad about creating a colony out of Puerto Rico is that the United States was able to preserve a racial hierarchy as they expanded sugar plantations and a sugar monoculture that heavily depended and relied on the bodies and labor of enslaved people. And so through much U.S. control, we see how color becomes a key element to social hierarchy in Puerto Rico, resulting in many inequalities, discrimination, and many different types of peasantries for black Puerto Ricans. And this color hierarchy isn't something that we just see in Puerto Rico. It happens to many other Latin American communities as well, as where they're fighting against and with legacies of slavery, colonialism, and imperialism, they become a racialized identity where Latinidad and Hispanic is both non-white, but particularly non-black. Many countries will blame their blackness as to why they are inferior to the U.S. and attempt to assimilate using blackness as a scapegoat. This is a big reason why we see that blackness and Latinidad are such different identities that can't seemingly align with one another. And so in the fight against class inequality, against the color hierarchy, and following the Jones Act of 1917, many Puerto Ricans start to migrate and create translocal enclaves in places like New York. The term New Rican was a fusion of New York and Puerto Rican, and it was a politically charged identity for both Puerto Rico and the United States. In the States, the term represented citizens who were a nation on the move who were continuously resisting assimilation and marginalization tactics for their blackness. And in Puerto Rico, New Ricans were seen as people who settled to New York, they migrated there, they were less authentic Puerto Ricans, they were seen as inferior, and they were seen as people who assimilated to United States culture. As mentioned previously, there's an ongoing story of U.S. presence, and then there's also an ongoing story of discrimination towards black Puerto Ricans within Puerto Rico. So following the 1917 Jones Act, with the promise of economic benefit, better living conditions, the myth of the American dream, many Puerto Ricans began to migrate to the United States. Jesus Colon is one of these many people who arrived in New York at the age of 17 as a stowaway on a ship to Brooklyn in 1918. And so through the historical context, as well as Jesus Colon's story himself in being a New Yorican eventually, we get a bit of this context of what it meant to be New Yorican. It was this unique and dual marginalization and this back and forth racial and national identity struggle that plagued black Puerto Ricans. They weren't American or specifically anti-American. They were a colony in Puerto Rico. They faced colonial conditions in the United States, and they were placed in positions where they always had to prove their identities and sometimes weren't given the chance to do so. Now that we understand both important historical contexts as to how a black Puerto Rican finds themselves within New York and what the term New Yorican means, we can start to analyze Jesus Colon's A Puerto Rican in New York and other sketches and find its place in New Yorican literature. Being black and Latina, especially transnationally, was a unique experience for New Yoricans, and much of New Yorican literature attests to that, where they write about wanting to be seen and accurately representing themselves across racial and national boundaries. We can see that same message written within the preface of this very book. To even start the very preface of this book, Jesus Colon says, very little has been written about the Puerto Rican in New York City. He also writes about how they were unwanted, unassimilable Puerto Ricans, and how his book was a modest attempt by a Puerto Rican who has lived in New York many years, always among his own people, through the medium of personal experience to throw a little light on how Puerto Ricans in the city really feel, think, work, and live. I think this is a really important way to start this book, to set it clear that Puerto Rican and black people were relegated to the last rung of New York's social ladder, that there's a present ignorance and misinformation spread about black and Puerto Rican people that Jesus Colon is going to take the position of countering. I think to start a book like this depicts the significance of the back and forth struggle to represent oneself and the inconsistent ways that black Puerto Rican identity unravels within New York. I think it also displays the clever and powerful ways black Puerto Ricans chose to resist their marginalization and find their sense of identity through literature. A large portion of Neo-Rican literature, and no differently within this book, are the experiences that highlight the dynamics of someone's cultural and racial identification. Through his many different chapters, we can see how the Black and Latina experience is marked by the different ways that the U.S. enforces the racial binary and really pertain to his blackness. Some key moments that are evident of this in his writing are when he gets a job translating Spanish in films for Latin American consumers, and when he goes to actually get a job offer and have stable employment, they deny him a job because they thought that he was white. Another example is where he sees a white woman in need of help and has a dilemma on what to do. He tells himself that courtesy is a trait of Puerto Ricans, and he understands that he should be courteous and he should help this white woman, but ultimately he contemplates for so long and he thinks about how his blackness will be received by this white woman that he ends up not helping this woman at all. I chose these situations because I thought they were really interesting examples and that they display the extent in which Jesus's cultural identity and experiences in being Latina become tainted by the ways that others and maybe his blackness will be received. He has denied his Latinidad strictly because of his blackness at many times. The latter example of him and the white woman is particularly striking to me because it shows just how much the racial binary in the U.S. affects Puerto Ricans, to the point where a black Puerto Rican ultimately and willingly refuses to help somebody and won't be a Puerto Rican and won't be himself because he thinks that his blackness will be received the wrong way. And in just a couple of pages of writing, I think that Jesus Colon really identifies the pressures that black Puerto Ricans undergo to successfully analyze what identity they need to be and what identity will be chosen for them instantaneously. There is no simply being a black Puerto Rican. Jesus Colon is forced to move accordingly and choose whether their blackness or Latinidad will be acceptable in that moment, which is really telling about the black Latina experience, the degree of black dehumanization and discrimination, and just how much the unsteadiness and legacies of colonialism, slavery, and imperialism have caused the black Latina identity to be split into two. And I think I latched onto this writing so much because globalizing the struggle for collective freedom was also a very prominent feature in much of Neo-Rican literature, and Jesus Colon operates no differently. He joined many papers and wrote for them, many times writing to address the abuses and violations of civil rights that were occurring towards Latin Americans. He writes particularly about Antonio Maceo, who was a black Cuban who died fighting for Cuban independence, fighting against black slavery, racial inequality, and against U.S. imperialism. He also notes that Maceo wanted to fight for Puerto Rican independence after Cuba gained its independence. He makes note of many of the dictator government countries in Latin America like Chile, Guatemala, and Argentina, and understands the neo-colonial power the U.S. has to indirectly control these countries and reproduce colonial conditions of slavery, of forced labor, of things like concentration camps, and suppressing people who will protest against them. He particularly criticizes Rafael Trujillo, the dictator of the Republic of Santo Domingo. He mentions how Trujillo has been coddled and protected by the U.S., how he ordered the massacre of 20,000 Haitian agricultural workers, how he suppressed sugar plantation strikes, and how he hid conditions of slavery of the Dominican people. In page 75, he writes to the people suffering, "Salud, brothers and sisters, workers and progressive intellectuals of Santo Domingo. You are not alone." And I really love these writings about Latin America, not only because he globalizes the struggle and fights for collective freedom, but it really speaks to the black Latina experience and speaks to the ways that racial categorizations were affected by legacies of marginalization towards Latin America, affected a lot by U.S. imperialism and, obviously other colonial conditions reproduced by Latin American countries. And I think every mention that Jesus Colon makes is particularly important. He makes mention of Antonio Maceo and the struggle for black freedom. The Trujillo mention is very specific, who was a black Cuban who was known for bleaching his face, for racial persecution, and for all of his countless crimes against humanity towards black people. And even through these writings, I think Jesus holds a lot of pride for his Latinidad, and this is why he fights and globalizes the struggle for Latin Americans in general so much. Despite everything that he has gone through, and despite how much his blackness dictates his experiences in the United States, he holds these transnational identities in politics and continues to fight for Latin America. I think he does a purposeful job of talking about the marginalization and assimilation tactics that Latin Americans go through, and how much Latin America operates its racial categories in proximity to both whiteness and the United States. I think Jesus Colon writes about how Latin America is stuck in this loophole of being in the in-between. He talks about how they are inferior and they're seen as non-white, and in their attempts to assimilate and to properly attempt to become more closer to whiteness, they end up reproducing those same colonial conditions onto people many times because of their blackness. And this is why I find it so interesting, and I think think it's very intentional that when he writes about the discrimination he faced as a little boy in Puerto Rico, he says that it's because of his lack of whiteness, not particularly because he's black. And so to wrap up my analysis, in conclusion, I think Jesus Colon adds a ton of valuable literature and documents the unique black and Latina experience migrating from colonial condition to more colonial conditions from Puerto Rico to the United States. Controlled by the U.S. on both sides, black Puerto Ricans have special struggles that consistently move them back and forth between racial and national identifications, rendering them a community that is both lost because of their blackness and both lost because of their Latinidad. And in Chapter 9, How to Know the Puerto Ricans, I think Jesus Colon really attests to this feeling of being in the middle of nowhere and being in space where you don't belong, and it's really difficult to even answer what your identity is. Some quotes that I felt truly highlighted this experiences were: one, when he was asked, how do you know the Puerto Ricans? He said, we have to admit from the start that we have no complete answer to open the door to the Puerto Ricans' houses, minds, and hearts. We have to confess every day we are adding to that answer. Another quote, he writes, Puerto Ricans have been exploited for hundreds of years, that strangers have been knocking at the door of the Puerto Rican nation for centuries, always in search of something, to get something or to take away something from the Puerto Ricans. And I think lastly, I'll just end off with this quote that really speaks to the unique Black and Latina experience and this back and forth ride, is he says, this feeling in the Puerto Rican